Following US President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 50% tariff on steel, Canada lowered its metal curtain. The most peaceful border of the 21st century turned into an industrial war zone overnight. Ottawa responded immediately when tariffs on steel and aluminum rose from 25% to 50%. Canada added automatic tariffs on US metals. Containers are being turned away at the Port of Vancouver. Detroit's press lines are looking for raw materials, and markets are waiting with bated breath for July 16th, the day of reckoning in the metal duel. This is not just a customs dispute, it is a test of North American integration and a new signpost for the global supply chain. So, what does the future hold for the North American supply chain? We will examine the details of the latest developments around the world. Before the second Donald Trump term has even entered its sixth month, one of the pillars that has held up the North American economic architecture for 40 years has been broken. The principle of free flow of metal trade. With the presidential declaration he signed at the end of March, the president raised the existing tariff on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50% overnight. The national security argument, known as Section 232, was not directed solely at traditional rivals such as China, Russia, or Iran this time, but equally targeted Washington's NATO ally Canada, its allies at the G7 table, and its USMCA partner Mexico. At the signing ceremony, Trump stated, "Strong trade means a strong military. Weak steel is no different from weak borders," while cameras failed to capture the full extent of the shock on the faces of senators. Even in Congress, very few people were waiting for the White House to double the tariff. The dollar index jumped more than 1% on the same day. Futures contracts on the Chicago Metal Exchange hit their limits, and supply chain managers in Detroit and Windsor had to revise their orders at the beginning of the week. In Canada, the political turmoil was immediately reflected on the streets. Prime Minister Mark Carney, when he appeared before Parliament in front of cameras, used the phrase "single Canadian economy" for the first time. This definition signaled a rhetorical break for Ottawa, which had embraced the slogan "North American integration" since the 1990s. Carney said, "The step taken by the United States is a global step. Therefore, we will respond without disrupting the global picture, but with our national interests in mind." This statement formed the legal basis for the Reciprocal Framework Regulation, published in the Official Gazette the following morning. The regulation, referring to the Emergency Authority provision of the Canadian Customs Tariff Act, announced the introduction of tariffs on US origin steel and aluminum products starting at 25%, to be increased in stages effective July 21st. But the real innovation was that the tax rate would not be fixed, but would be automatically adjusted according to the pace of progress in the ongoing economic and security partnership negotiations between the two countries. This mechanism provided a flexibility that had not been used since the 1990 Customs Harmonization Framework. In other words, Ottawa would not have to wait for a decision by the Council of Ministers to lower or raise tariffs. Any developments in the negotiations would be directly reflected in the tax rate. Upon publication of the regulation, François-Philippe Champagne, the minister responsible for the Industry Canada portfolio, announced 2 additional columns at a press conference in Ottawa: a public procurement filter and a strategic quota system. The first column provided for the prioritization of the use of Canadian-sourced steel and aluminum in all infrastructure projects funded by the federal budget. A broad list ranging from Defense Ministry ship modernization contracts to high-speed railways planned in the prairie provinces was included in the ministry's slides. The International Competitive Bidding Standard would continue in public tenders, but bid documents would have to include detailed disclosures about the country of origin for the melting and casting of materials. As a result, American suppliers would lose their first equal status in tenders unless they produced in Canada. Another column introduced origin-based quotas for steel plates, billets, profiles, and aluminum ingots, which could be applied retroactively until January 1st, 2025. This retroactive provision also covers goods waiting in Canadian ports that have not yet been declared for customs, leading to the redirection of some containers at the ports of Vancouver and St. John. The package, which was not limited to customs duties and procurement restrictions, came under the title of the $10 billion Large Business Tariff Credit. The program became known in the market as BETCO. The aim was to provide bridge financing at favorable interest rates to manufacturing companies whose cash flow had been disrupted by tariffs, but which were of strategic importance, and to protect jobs. Applications were processed through the Canada Development Bank, with credit limits of up to $50 million per company. One of the conditions was that beneficiaries had to submit a relocation plan within the northern border for their raw material supply chain. As a result, the program went beyond short-term liquidity support to encourage medium-term reshoring or nearshoring strategies. Ottawa's commitment to real-time monitoring of market stability was implemented through sectoral action tables. Steel, aluminum, automotive, machinery, and infrastructure were divided into 5 main tables, each with federal finance, industry, and trade officials, as well as representatives from the Congress of Labour Unions, the Canadian Council of Employers, and mining and metal trade associations. Weekly consultation reports summarize price movements, capacity utilization rates, and export order trends. If necessary, they issue tariff adjustment recommendations to the Economic Cabinet. The system is, in a way, a permanent version of the critical supply intervention committees established during the pandemic. This time, however, it is monitoring the heavy industry supply chain rather than medical supplies. Washington's response was swift. The White House press secretary described Canada's measures as insincere and unnecessary, while the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, announced that it was considering options to file a complaint against Canada with the WTO. However, it could not escape criticism from its own industrialists. The Michigan Steel Producers Association reiterated its warning that the tariffs would disrupt the integrated automotive supply chain, as Detroit's press line still relied on high-strength steel from Ontario. The Aluminum Association of America pointed out that advanced manufacturing giants such as Boeing and SpaceX depended on alloys from Canadian foundries. The Trump administration hinted that it would open a window of exemption for American manufacturers to offset the input shock. But Ottawa made it clear that it would not lower the tariff rate until the exemption list was published. Political tensions also heated up at the Kananaskis Resort in Alberta, the venue chosen for the G7 summit. Rumors leaked that Trump and Carney had heated exchanges behind closed doors, but ultimately a two-stage timeline emerged, with 30 days of intensive negotiations, a progress test on July 16th, and a final decision on July 30th. This timeline created reference dates for option pricing in the markets. July mid-month, FOB Cleveland HRC, hot-rolled coil, contract premiums surged to record levels. This was because traders were bearing inventory costs in anticipation of a potential tariff adjustment at the beginning of July. The domestic political dimension in Canada is also noteworthy. National opposition parties accused the Carney government of belated retaliation and questioned why tariffs would come into effect on July 21st instead of July 1st. The government argued that the delay was necessary to coordinate with other partners such as the EU, Japan, and South Korea. Indeed, Brussels began preparing temporary tariffs, dubbed a steel waiting shield, in coordination with Ottawa, while in Tokyo, METI bureaucrats proposed to buffer supply bottlenecks by planning small shipments of semi-finished aluminum to Canada. This diplomatic chess game turned Trump's tariffs into a global rabbit hole, with each country building new walls to protect its own steel and transferring the risk of oversupply to third countries. A less publicized but no less significant part of Canada's retaliation package was the melt cast origin requirement. This rule insisted that the facility where the raw material was first melted and the facility where the finished product was given its final form must be the same or part of an agreed value chain. As a result, US producers would no longer be able to shape cheap Chinese raw material in Mexico and sell it to Canada with a Made in the USA label. The rule introduced new obligations for North American supply chain oversight to block indirect import channels. Through the addition of a dual traceability form to customs declarations, the CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, will be able to track all production steps of a shipment. Importers were required to submit chemical analysis reports from every link in their supply chain in order to obtain an importer assurance certificate. This complex paperwork will create commercial friction in the short term, but in the long term, it will provide Ottawa with a treasure trove of information that amounts to economic espionage. The Build Canada Fund, which channels resources into infrastructure financing, has also quickly adapted to the new era. The domestic metal usage ratio has been added to the fund's investment decision matrix. Nationwide, 24 billion Canadian dollars worth of pipeline, highway, bridge, and railway projects have been revised. The largest project is the Green Hydrogen Corridor, which will stretch from the Atlantic coast to the Prairie region. The project company, which initially considered steel pipes from Japan's NKK and South Korea's POSCO, is now turning its attention to Tenaris's Ontario Sault Ste. This shift in demand has the potential to bring Ontario's 3.5 million ton annual capacity to full capacity within 2 years. Unions have already announced 1,000 new job postings. The political rhetoric of the package was presented with the slogan, "Building the strongest economy in the G7." Carney did not limit his emphasis on the relentless fight to the external trade dimension. On the fiscal front, a national investment strategy was also unveiled. The defense budget share was increased to 2.8%, but 1/3 of this increase is earmarked for orders directed toward domestic metal producers. The Royal Navy's new Arctic patrol ships will use Canadian steel in Halifax shipyards, and the proportion of scrap metal in the ship's hull will be minimized due to the risk of customs duties. This will create additional demand for recycling companies and promote green steel, creating opportunities for exports to the EU. One of the most subtle elements of the countermeasures was the targeted exemption window, which came to be known as the Bull Gate, Tariff Gate. Ottawa announced that it would grant temporary exemptions to US suppliers for very specific alloys used in critical public infrastructure, aerospace, and medical devices, but that this would be implemented in a measured manner. When applying for exemptions, companies must submit a 10-part file, including a moment of inertia technical report, third-party analysis demonstrating insufficient capacity in Canada, and an import scenario. This process imposes bureaucratic pressure while also signaling incentives for Canadian suppliers to expand their product ranges. For example, a thin plate casting factory in Montreal has begun importing German equipment to produce nickel-chromium alloy for aircraft landing gear for the first time. The Export Development Canada will provide low-interest project financing. In the medium term, this will organically reduce the need for US-exempt imports. The rest of the international community has not been idle either. The European Commission has declared the US metal tariffs contrary to WTO rules, and pointed to the political nature of the exemptions it has granted. But instead of announcing automatic retaliation like Canada, Brussels is working on a coordinated EU defense instrument. In Berlin, the German Steel Federation envies Canada's speed and complains about the slowness of Europe's collective reflexes. French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire has instructed the European Investment Bank to expand its green steel bond package, aiming to create a flow of affordable financing for EU steel projects. This will allow the EU to adopt a market support strategy rather than directly retaliating against US tariffs. As the critical date of July 16th approaches on the Washington-Ottawa front, market players are weighing whether a coordinated withdrawal or a permanent tariff war scenario will prevail. The Fed is concerned that additional metal costs will push inflation back up as US domestic demand cools. The Bank of Canada, meanwhile, will activate the hedge ratio if financing costs in dollars rise. In any case, steel and aluminum are no longer just engineering inputs. They have become a multi-layered threshold parameter that cuts across national security, diplomacy, pension fund allocation, regional development, and voter psychology. In short, while Trump's 50% tariff is calling into question North American integration, Canada's response package is unilaterally revising a century-old common market reflex. From imported steel rolls to parliamentary debates, from customs declarations to energy corridor strategies, the chain is redefining Canada's economic sovereignty. A single Canada industrial ecosystem where ore extracted from its own mines will be smelted in its own furnaces and developed under the protective umbrella of public procurement. This new roadmap is reshaping North America's metal molds with political fire while irreversibly altering the flow of global supply chains. What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments section.